Bueno, pues estamos con Steve Albini, ya lo presentaron, él es ingeniero de grabación y músico, y pues lo vamos a dejar hablar mucho a él. Hello, Steve.
Hello.
First of all, I wanted to give some context of what you do. You're a musician, you started as a musician, and then you started recording your friends. You fell in love with punk rock through a Ramones album. Can you please give your story, the origin story, please?
Well, so far you're doing better than me. But I first really took notice of music in the 1970s. I became a fan of the Ramones and by extension punk rock and the whole underground, the continuity of the underground, going backwards from punk rock into the psychedelic era and the sort of political hard rock of the 60s and 70s. And that made me want to participate in this culture. And so I formed a band with my friends. And when I moved to Chicago, I grew up in Montana in a college town, but in a very sparsely populated state. So not a lot of people around. And I moved to Chicago to go to college, and I got involved in the underground scene, the punk scene in Chicago. And that has basically formed my identity, like working with those people, learning how to function as an underground community, that has informed every aspect of my life.
You studied journalism.
I studied journalism academically in school, but I only worked as a journalist in reality for a few months on a small newspaper. So I don't really qualify as a journalist, but yeah.
I wanted to ask you if there was anything you studied in journalism that applies to your life as a record engineer or musician.
No, I can see a thread of continuity. I wanted to become a journalist because I felt there were underserved communities and people whose stories were not part of the general narrative. Like when you read the newspaper or when you watch the television news, you're hearing from the heads of business and, you know, politically important people and people who have money and people who have status. But there's a whole, you know, universe below that level of significance, which is where all of us live. Like we all live in this other part of the world. And I felt like that part of the world was underrepresented in the published, you know, the history of our culture. The main part of it is underrepresented or underreported. And I thought, naively, I could be one of the people that brings this part to the forefront, like the day-to-day, the real life of people to the forefront of journalism. And it took a very short exposure to professional journalism to completely wipe that idea out of my head, you know. And I worked on a small newspaper and I realized that the reason news is framed the way it is because newspapers are a business, and so they function as part of the business community, which shakes hands with the political hierarchy, which is part of an overwhelming hierarchy of elitism, and you cannot function inside those institutions in an effort to break those institutions or change those institutions. And I think that informed many areas of my life, but principally in music, I realized that being outside of the mainstream was not a handicap. In fact, it was liberating, because if you are not trying to become successful in conventional terms, if you're not trying to get on MTV, if you're not trying to be signed to a big label, if you're not trying to get on Top of the Pops or whatever, then you have complete freedom in what you're doing, and you can function in this underground network as a self-governing, self-fulfilling community that doesn't need to pay any attention to the mainstream, to the big picture. The big corporate world doesn't need to enter into your life at all. And I feel comfortable that my functioning in the music underground is an example of how to function without being beholden to a bigger corporate entity or having to participate in these unpleasant structures, you know.
You were while you were mentioning some people being underrepresented. I was thinking about how, as making records, you have helped scenes and music that is underrepresented to come to the forefront too.
I mean, that's my natural environment. I've always felt like I was part of an underground community, and it's normal to want to help your neighbors and your friends and the people who are close by. And so I made myself a resource to the people in the underground. And to this day, I'm still, you know, my normal clientele is not super famous people. It's working musicians. It's bands who are writing their own music and trying to get their own music out into the public to serve their own creative interest and not as a part of a business strategy.
I think it's very important that people. I mean, you have talked a lot about it, but maybe some people here don't know how do bands approach to work with you. How the way you speak about it, it's like a very simple process.
Yeah, I pride myself on being available. When the phone rings at the studio, often I am the guy that answers the phone. And if it's not me, you can just say, "Can I talk to Steve?" And they'll pass me the phone. It's a very straightforward process. I don't have any management. I don't have any lawyers or contracts or anything in between me and the people that I work with. You can literally send me an email or call me on the phone, and we can organize a session. And it doesn't have to be any more complicated than that.
But do you have to like the band, or do you have to have some affinity? I mean,
no. I think that this is a kind of a complex subject, but I was in a band that was very ugly. I was in a band called Big Black, and we made ugly, violent music. And I knew that other people did not like this music, right? So if I went into a studio to record that music, and it was dependent on the engineer liking our music, we would get nowhere, right? And so I want to give that same courtesy to everybody else. You might be in a band that I don't understand at all. I'm familiar with that situation because I was in a band that nobody else understood, right? And so my obligation as an engineer is to do a good job for you, precisely the same as if my absolute favorite band in the world came into the studio. My job is as a professional is to make sure that you are satisfied with your session. And it's not dependent on me being a fan of your music. In fact, I think that kind of thinking is dangerous in the studio because you start to pass judgment on people, and you work harder for things that you like and less hard on things that you don't like. And I think that's a very dangerous, very corrosive mentality. So I try very hard in the studio to remove my aesthetics, my sense of taste, for my own pleasure. I remove that from the professional process. And if you want to make music that's not something I would listen to at home, then I still have the obligation to be a professional, you know?
In that sense, I was thinking that you're like a doctor. You go to a doctor, he doesn't care if you are tall or short or fat or...
Yeah, I've described it in a number of ways, like an auto mechanic, right? Okay. Sometimes someone brings you a car, and it's a really cool old car that you've been fascinated with your whole life, and you love the intricacies of this car. And so, you know, it's a sensual pleasure to work on this car that you know intimately already. And sometimes somebody brings some broken down thing that is going to be a real pain in the ass, and you're going to have to weld a bunch of things together. but you still do it, you know? It's still your obligation to fix the car. I also have described it as like being a barber, you know? And when I go to the barber, I tell the barber how to cut my hair. He doesn't tell me how he's going to cut my hair, you know? And I think that's a perfect analogy. If a band comes to the studio and they say, we want to record our band like this, my job as an engineer is to do it, you know?
But for example, are there any, I'm going to insist on this, any checks, like if a disco band came to your studio?
Stylistic things don't matter to me at all. The style of music that you want to play, that's your business. That's not my department, you know? There are some problematic things that, like, I don't want to be involved in music that is politically intended to harm other people or is malicious music, you know? So no Nazis and, you know, no bigots, and
that's
basically it.
That's a great posture.
Yeah. If your music is intended to harm other people who are less fortunate than you or less advantaged than you, then you don't need me to work on that. You can use anybody, you know.
You said that Big Black made ugly music and that your taste is, but I don't know if this is legit, but I was seeing a playlist with your 20 favorite songs. It has some Dolly Parton, some Bill Withers, so some really nice music that people I don't think they normally associate with you. And the point I wanted to touch is that people think you as, I mean, I've read these, to me, ridiculous nicknames like the architect of grunge or stuff like that. But how do you feel about it? I mean, having this broad taste and then being reduced to...
There's something that has happened in the last maybe 30 years to the listening of music that I think is really interesting. During the analog era, when everything was on the radio or in a record store, everybody heard the same music. Like the top 40 radio in every city, everybody heard the same songs on the top 40 on the radio. And if you go to the record store, the best sellers in the record store were the same everywhere. So everyone heard the same music. But now, if you go to any office anywhere in the world, and you just pick up somebody's phone and you look through their playlist of what they've been listening to, it's the weirdest collection of shit, you know? It's like there'll be some African music, some Japanese video game music, some pop songs from the 60s, there'll be some disco banger. You know, it's just like everything is so personal now. Like what you like as a person is what you listen to. And nobody else has any influence on what you listen to. And I think that's amazing. I think that's a really incredible development. But it betrays something that I think has always been true. And that is that everybody likes many styles of music. Like if you talk to the drummer in a heavy metal band, he doesn't just listen to heavy metal. He listens to all kinds of music. There's probably some, you know, fancy jazz drumming that he listens to for inspiration. There's probably tribal drumming or, you know, symphonic percussion ensembles that influence his style and influence their taste and the way they think about music. And that's true for everybody. That's true for the person that works at the grocery store. It's true for every single person. And it's especially true for young people. Like like teenagers go through these cliquish things among their friends where they're listening to, you know, K-pop was very big for a while with teenagers in America. Music that is in a different language, from a different culture and a different artistic sentiment. But for some reason, it was very popular with American teenagers, you know, and no one could have predicted it. So that sort of thing is, I think, is a natural extension of the availability of music now. Everybody has access to everything. And so everyone gets to indulge these very specific tastes. I think that's a beautiful development.
It's great. You don't have to to buy every record to in a way that's one of the benefits of the internet. No,
Yeah.
I was listening an interview from that you did with Mark Maron probably 8 years ago, 9 years ago, and you were saying that the internet. Uh, if I misquote you, please let me tell me that the internet, in a way, you liked it, that it replaced or saved some of the communities that existed in when you were starting as a musician, as a punk rock musician, the small communities in every town, and they were now living online. And you were optimist. I
Yeah.
could hear some optimism in your opinion about the internet. Do you 9 years later feel the same way?
I would say I am still optimistic. There have been some developments in the politics of streaming that have been unflattering, have been bad developments where their streaming services are making certain things that are exclusive to their streaming services and that sort of thing, which I think that's regressive. But I think the general thrust of things is that everyone has more access to music now than they ever did, and they have more variety at their disposal than they ever did. And as a result, it is possible for bands to operate and as small businesses in a way that was not possible previously. There are tools, things like Bandcamp and other tools, where bands can create a presence online. They can have a YouTube channel, and they can have their own website and various other things. And that allows for a very direct connection with their audience. And the audience does not have to be in their immediate locale. Like a band from Guadalajara can have an audience in Japan and Europe and America, and those same people can support them. And that worldwide access is a unique feature of the modern music distribution era. Because in the physical media era, you would have to manufacture records and put them in a box and send them overseas, and then they would go to a distributor, and he would have to send them to a store, and the store would have to convince someone to buy them. And it was a very slow process and usually failed. And now, if you have a good idea, you post it up on your YouTube channel, and tomorrow morning you'll find out how good an idea it is, because you will either have, 1 million views or 10 views in the morning.
I'm going to be indiscreet here. We were talking backstage about how problematic the economy in certain platforms could be. I mean, maybe you can talk about it, but I also wanted to ask, I also read that you, and this is very interesting to me, you don't like the way music sounds on them. You said that if you really want to listen to a record, you have to play it like in a physical format. But could you elaborate on both things?
Yeah, I don't have a really strong opinion about the sound of analog versus the sound of digital. I mean, I am an engineer, and from a technical standpoint, even when I'm working in an analog format, I am trying very hard to make it sound exactly the same when I hear the playback as when I heard the original performance. I'm trying very hard. I don't always succeed, but that's what my goal is. And in a digital setting, there are fewer considerations, fewer technical considerations. I find myself less engaged with digital playback than I am with analog playback. And that's just me as a listener. But I think it's partly from the unique experience I have of every day I'm hearing live performances of music through the desk, through the loudspeakers. I'm hearing bands playing their music. And then on playback, I'm hearing master recordings played back through a very good sound system. So my exposure to music on a professional level every day is extremely high quality. So I'm hearing a very good representation of bands playing at their peak performance every day. That's normal for me. So when I get in the car and I turn on the stereo in the car, it's going to be unsatisfying. It's not the same experience. The same is true when I play music on my phone or when someone plays music on a home hi-fi. It's not the same.
Fall short.
It's not as exciting, but as a fan, I can still hear music on the phone or, on a little Bluetooth speaker or something. And if I like it, I like it, and I still respond to the music the same way. There was an analogy I made when you're speaking to your mother, for example, on the telephone. The sound coming out of the telephone, that's not what she sounds like. She doesn't sound like that. But you can recognize her in the sound. And because you recognize your mother, you know it's this person that has meant so much to you. And you have this emotional connection with that person through the telephone. The sound is not important. The connection is important. The identification is important. And I feel the same way about listening to music. You listen to music on a crappy Bluetooth speaker or out of your telephone. That's not what Grand Funk sounds like, But you can identify Grand Funk and you recognize what Grand Funk meant to you, or it doesn't matter who it is. Any artist that means something to you, you can recognize them in the sound, and that connection is recreated. You reinvigorate that connection, that emotional bond that you have with those people. And that, to me, matters way more than frequency response or dynamic range or any of the technical bullshit,
That's more the point, no?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And also, it's fine. Like, if you're just puttering around the house doing housework and you have a crappy little tabletop system playing and it's not hi-fi, it's fine. It's a casual listening of music, But if I'm working in a professional setting and I'm having to make a very minute distinction between 1 dB here, 1 dB there, then I need an accurate system just for its technical use, right? But if I'm listening passively, and like if I go to a show and the club has a crappy sound system, but the band is really exciting, the sound is not the thing. The performance is the thing. The human act is what is important, and you recognize it, even if it doesn't sound fantastic, So I'm not that critical about the sound of digital music. I don't think it matters. I think, and also, my experience is listening to very high quality analog playback all day, every day. That's my experience. If your experience is listening just to streaming services or MP3s or, copied cassettes or something, your experience will inform your pleasure in the same way that my experience informs mine. And I don't pass any judgment about that.
You're not snobbish about.
No. I have seen some home hi-fi systems which are shocking, like many speakers of all sizes in a vacuum tube power amp the size of a refrigerator, and a turntable with a Volkswagen motor running it. I've seen some really incredible home hi-fis, right? And this is tens of thousands of dollars is invested in this. And when you hear Bill Withers played back on it, it sounds like Bill Withers. It's great. You recognize it in the same way. But also, if you play Bill Withers on a boombox sitting on the shelf, it sounds like Bill Withers to me, and I'm comfortable with any of these things.
It's kind of elitist, no? Think that you need this huge
Some
sound
people
system.
get a pleasure out of it in the same way that someone gets pleasure out of building a model train set. They're super into the details of the model train layout, and for them, that's important. And that's where their pleasure is. That's the thing that animates them, is perfection in this way that only they understand. And I can't find fault with that. That seems fine to me. I mean, it's crazy, but fine, It's like someone who, puts a bone through their nose or something, you get something out of that, and it's fine,
Was that a Neil Young reference?
No.
Because I heard that you really wanted to record Neil Young someday, and I only mentioned it because of the train thing you said.
I admire Neil Young. He is a very clear example of someone who does not give a fuck what the rest of the industry, what the rest of his peer group are doing. He is following his nose toward a guiding star that only he can see, you know? And I admire him tremendously. His music has meant the world to me. And now he's, you know, as a senior citizen, he is still making music that just makes me cry, you know? It's amazing. And the reason it's valuable is not because he has adopted certain features from the world at large and made some kind of philosophical adjustments. It's because he's a maniac, and he's going toward his mania with no apology, you know? And I'm certain that's why I respond to his music, is because it's so important for him to get it right, you know?
He's amazing.
Yeah.
And, okay, going back to the way you record a band, can you, maybe this is hard, and I don't know if it's the same with every artist that comes to your studio, but how does it start? How do you start to record? What do you do? How much distance do you keep? Because I've heard that you keep certain distance, no? That
Well,
because some producers, which you are not, sometimes act like a referee between band members. They arrange the songs, and you don't do that.
So this is kind of an involved topic, but the distinction in my mind between myself and a producer, a conventional record producer, is that the record producer is directing the session. He's saying, you go here, this is how this is going to happen, we're going to bring the strings in here. You know, like the producer is essentially directing the behavior of everyone in the studio for his own purpose, for his own idea, his own conception of the music. And I have seen producers that behave this way. I own a studio, and sometimes other producers are working there, and I've seen this in person. But I don't do that. When the band, the first contact, as we discussed, is just a phone call or an email or something. And then when the band arrives, we have a conversation. What bands are you into? What kind of music do you like? Do you have any overall conception of this record? Are you going to be changing instruments? Do you have, are there any specific songs that we need to attend to some details on? You have a conversation with the band and understand their expectation. And then normally you set the band up so they're all playing simultaneously. And that is a philosophical point for me, is that when a band is working on their music, they are all playing together, they're rehearsing together, they perform together on stage. 99% of their existence as a band is as a group working simultaneously. And so when they come into the studio, I like them to be able to behave normally. Like, you are all playing together, you're all synchronized with each other, you can see each other, you can hear each other and comment to each other, you can make real-time adjustments. All of that happens in a normal way, in the way that a band would behave on stage or in rehearsal. Now, most of the time, there is something extra being done, either overdubs or some difference between the live performance and the recorded performance. And so you need to address those differences. Like, there are going to be extra instruments or extra vocals, or we're having some guests come or something like that. So most of the time, the live performance is the beginning, and then you adjust from there and add from there. But I do like to begin the session by having the band playing their music live as normal. And that, to me, that's a matter of respect. Like, when a band comes to the studio, I don't think my place is to say, I know you play this song 10 times in rehearsal, and you played it 100 times on stage, but you're playing it wrong. What you have to do is do it this way now, because I am the super genius that has determined that you're wrong about your own music, So I don't do that. I think it's rude, and I strive to allow the bands to behave normally in the studio.
Do you always keep this sort of distance, or there have been times that you come closer to the band?
Well, certainly the first time that I work with someone, I want them to feel like they are in control and that they have complete freedom to do what they like. There are some people that I have worked with many times, and we have a good working relationship, and I have learned to internalize their aesthetic, and I understand the things that they like and don't like. And so in those cases, I can sometimes add a little bit of extra confidence in a situation where there is some doubt. But most of the time, even for bands that I've worked with many times, I try to be an employee rather than a manager.
Do you think you've done like more than 1,000 records, no?
Yeah, a large number.
Do you think people say there's Steve Albini sound? I'm not sure. I was listening in the morning to Electrolane, which is a record I love. And I don't think it sounds anything like the Pixies, but that's my opinion. But do you think there is such a thing as a Steve Albini sound?
When someone says that, I know what they're talking about. They're not speaking nonsense, right? There is a certain idiom of rock music which has a minimalist presentation and a very aggressive presentation, and there is a kind of a critical balance between the band intensity and the vocalist intensity, and a lot of those bands gravitate toward the same sound quality. Mm-hmm. And I completely understand what someone is saying when they say there is a Steve Albini sound. I also know that I have done bluegrass albums and country albums and jazz records and experimental music records where those kinds of things don't apply. I just, because it was me, I know that there is more, right, than that one idea. But I don't think people they're not talking nonsense when they say that. They have identified something that is real, a real phenomenon, yeah.
And if you, but you can also do very subtle things like the Palace records or Low, which are beautiful.
Yeah, part of my job as an engineer is to be available and professional with any style of music. And you have named some simple and pretty records that I've worked on, and I am just as focused on my job in that setting as I am for some grunty garage rock band, you know? I mean, it's the same job with a different client.
And do you find a common thread between the records you recorded like in the late 80s and the ones you're doing now, or they sound completely different? You changed your working process, your working methods? Has time changed your experience?
One thing that I do in the studio is I try to be aware of when I am falling into a habit. Like if I habitually use this microphone on this instrument, I become aware of that habit and I interrogate it and I start trying to question my methods. And I will experiment with a different microphone. I'll force myself to use a different microphone or a different technique as a way of keeping my skills finely tuned and as a way of making my behavior active and conscious as opposed to being routine and hypnotized, you know. I don't want to sleepwalk through a session and just do things the way I normally do. I want to be actively listening to what's happening in the studio and make a precise decision based on what is really happening rather than my own method, my preconception of, it's a snare drum, I always use this mic on the snare drum, you know. So I do try very diligently to question my behavior in the studio and to make adjustments and to try new things. I've mentioned this before, but my friend Bob Weston, who's also an excellent recording engineer, he's in the band I'm in. He mentioned in an interview one time that as a little exercise, he tries to do one thing on every session that he's never done before. It can be something small, like choose a different microphone or a different position, or try a different processing technique or a different patch on the console, something. Just do one thing that you've never done before. And I thought that was really smart, because if it's only one thing, it's not going to ruin the record. But if it is one thing, then that's one thing that you now know a little bit better. You now understand one thing a little bit better. And so I've just stolen that idea from Bob Weston, and I try to do that on my sessions now. I try to make sure that there's one thing that I do every session that I've never done before.
10 records later, you have 10 different things.
Yeah. And sometimes these experiments have been very valuable. Like, some techniques. There's a technique for recording the cymbals on a drum kit, the overhead microphones on a drum kit. And I worked at a studio that had a house drum kit set up in the studio. And they had a couple of microphones set up, ribbon microphones behind the drummer's head, just facing out toward the drums from behind the drummer's head. And it was an interesting arrangement that I'd never seen before. And out of curiosity, I thought, well, that will be my experiment for the session, as I will try that. And it sounded great. And so I adopted it immediately. I just stole the technique, and I have been using it most of the time since then. And that was just one little experiment. I'll try that one thing, and it turned out to be a really big improvement,
I'm sure a lot of people here admire you and want to try having a career as a recording bands and artists, making records. Do you think it was very important? Not maybe it was for you, but do you think it's necessary to be a musician to be an engineer, or how can you start? How you transitioned from what? I mean, I know that your friends asked you to record and
yeah.
that, but
for me, it was all part of a continuous spectrum. I liked music, so I wanted to play music. So I had a band, and I hung out with other people that were into that music. And when you're in a band, all of your friends are in bands, and I wanted to record my band, and I was successful with that. And my friends then wanted me to record their bands, and then they told their friends, and by word of mouth, I became a professional engineer. Not by accident, but it was definitely a process that was not directed by me. Like, I didn't put advertisements in the newspaper. I didn't call people up and ask them to work with them. It was definitely a process that was a function of the way the underground community operated. Everything was word of mouth, and everyone was always in contact with everyone else. And so it was a natural progression for me. I do think being part of that community has informed my behavior in the studio and made me more sympathetic to the bands that I work with, made me more charitable in about their intentions, and made me more supportive and want to do a good job for them, right? So I think it was valuable. I think it is possible to get there purely academically, where you're not a musician, but you understand the academic way, in an academic way, you understand the behavior of the equipment. But I think that sympathy and that identification with the musicians has been very helpful for me.
And it comes from being a musician yourself.
I believe, yeah. I'll give you one anecdote. There was a band that I very much admired that was going into the studio in the 1980s, and they were going in to start recording an album. And I tagged along with them as a friend. I just wanted to see what was happening in the studio. And the engineer on that session was not part of the punk rock scene, part of the underground. Like, they had done a couple of records with people who were peers of theirs and were also parts of the sort of punk underground. And this was different. This was a more professional setting in a professional studio with a professional engineer. And the first thing that I noticed was that his instincts were to try to make this ugly, explosive, noisy band less ugly, less explosive, less noisy. And that started with the sound check, you know, like, oh, the guitar is too loud. Can you turn the guitar down? You know, you're hitting the snare drum so hard, you're overloading the microphone. Can you not hit so hard? Like small details like that. And the end result was that the recording was not that flattering of the band because it was defeating some of their identity, some of their personality. And the critical thing for me was to realize that this engineer was doing so, was causing this harm to the session with the best intentions. Like he was thinking, oh, this band doesn't know how to behave in the studio. I'm going to help them. And he was trying to help, trying to make things better. But because he came from a different aesthetic, fundamentally different aesthetic, him trying to help was actually making things weaker and making things less powerful. So in that way, it's certainly possible for me to misunderstand one of my clients' bands. Like somebody comes into the studio and I think their music is just a mess. And so I try to start organizing it, make it a little bit more more, you know, predictable, a little bit more regular. I'm making the same mistake if I do that. I'm doing the same amount of damage. And so I try very hard not to do that. And I credit this exposure with that thinking for myself.
We need more producers and engineers that let the bands be themselves, no?
What's amazing to me is if you leave bands alone, leave them to their own devices, and just like if you stop in on a rehearsal and listen to a band rehearsing, they sound great. Most of the time, they sound comfortable, they sound, you know, confident and natural. And if you go see a band on stage, they're playing in front of an audience, they're really projecting, they sound great, right? And when they get in the studio and someone is telling them, no, you're too fast for the metronome, you have to slow down a little bit, you know, or, you know, you can't jump around while you're playing, you're going to knock your guitar out of tune, you know.
That's the whole point of the band.
Then you see, there is no external definition of good for music. What's good for Motorhead is different from what's good for Sting. You know, like they're different bands. They're different identities, different behavior. And if Motorhead comes to the studio and the engineer wants them to sound like Sting, it's going to be a disaster, right? So I think that's the critical thing for anyone in my profession is when a band comes into the studio, trust them. They know what they're doing. They have worked this all out. That you don't have to get involved. You know, it's not your department. They have that part covered. You know.
Correct me if I misunderstand this, but I think what I get is that you try to record the band or to make the recording as a reflection of how they sound live, no? Yes?
That's a good shorthand for it. But the main thing is that I want them to have the experience in the studio that they want to have, you know?
Okay.
And some bands, they imagine when they go to the studio that their music will become fantastic. Like it starts very modest, but when they come to the studio, they want it to become fantastic.
That's a word you use a lot, fantastic. Yeah. I love it.
So in that case, my job is to understand what they mean. What do you mean by fantastic? You know, do you want it to sound like there are more of you? Do you want it to sound like it is from space? You know, like what do you mean? And then when you learn what their expectation is, then you can derive from that some procedures to create the kind of fantastic experience that they want to have. And at no point in that process does it matter what my opinion is, because I'm an employee. I'm working for the band. That's the critical distinction, I think.
So you're also interested in making records that are fantastic if the band...
Yeah.
Like, for example, I was thinking maybe when the Beatles did Sgt. Pepper's or when the
Yeah.
Beach Boys did Pet Sounds, these records sound nothing like they sounded live.
Sure. And
It's
that's
the opposite. It's like a different discipline.
Yeah,
You know?
I mean, I can give you a couple of examples. I've done many records with a heavy band called Neurosis, right? They don't exist anymore, but there were 5 people in the band, and it was a really hybrid approach of a super powerful, super heavy rock band, but they also had atmospheric and spacey moments in the music that was kind of psychedelic, and they had an electronics. They had a guy in the band who played electronics, and the electronics were sometimes the main feature of the music, where it was an alien sound. It wasn't a natural sound, right? So when I worked on a Neurosis record, the aesthetic was to preserve the power of the powerful elements without counterfeiting the spacey or psychedelic or beautiful moments, you know? And in order to do that, I have to respect this electronic and atmospheric quality to the same degree that I respect the hard rock part. I've done many records with a Japanese band called Mono, and their music is really beautiful. Most of their music starts at a very gentle, very romantic kind of melodic way that gradually evolves into full fucking heavy metal, you know. But at several points in there will sometimes be an orchestra, you know, or a string section, or a small pocket orchestra playing along with them. And to me, the most important thing is for every moment along that progression to be satisfying. Like, if you get the pretty part right, but the heavy part sounds distorted and noisy and messy, then you don't get the feeling of clarity. You don't have the same impact. And if the part at the beginning, the quiet part is okay and the heavy part is okay, but in the middle it sounds kind of dull and uninteresting, then you also have failed, you know? And with their music, many of the songs are 9, 10, 12 minutes long. And so you have to take each moment in the song as a project and understand the relationship of the different elements in each moment. And for me, as an engineer, those records are great to work on. They're very satisfying to work on. It's a lot of work, and you're actively thinking about every sound at every moment, and you have to, you know, keeping the balances normal so that you can understand and comprehend everything. It's extremely difficult, but when you play back, when you're finished and you hit playback and you listen to the whole thing, it's so satisfying to hear, you know.
I think people should go to listen to Neurosis after this talk.
I'm just going to tell one anecdote about Neurosis. There was a song. I don't remember the name of the song, unfortunately, but the song was building in intensity, and at the end of 7 or 8 minutes, there is a kind of an explosion where everything is like at full force. But then that continues for several minutes afterwards, where everything is at peak energy. And what they wanted was the sound of equipment failure. They wanted it to sound like at various moments like the equipment couldn't handle and things were just failing. So we came up with a method in the studio to create a kind of a static noise where after each instance of this kind of pulsing or static, the sound would get more distorted and more collapsing. And then at the end, the final stage would just be like a pure noise, formed from their original music, but just a complete saturated, distorted, noisy mess, which would then conclude with a very abrupt punctuation as though the system just overloaded and shut down. And the way that they accomplished this, like the way they described it, was, you know when you overload a cassette and the cassette sounds really distorted and you prefer that to the record? So for each of these instances, we copied their master tape to a cassette and then copied it back to the master tape. And then the next time there was one of these instances, we took the distorted copy, and copied it to a cassette and put it back on. And so they're in this $1 million studio with a $100,000 mixing desk and hundreds of thousands of dollars of microphones, and the sound, the perfect sound, was the sound of a cassette recording, a little bit too hot, you know.
Wow. Do you believe?
Come back in the control room, you listen, and it still sounds bad. So, okay, well, let's defeat the console. We'll go through the equipment and skip the console. Now it sounds good. Okay, so obviously there the console is the problem. And I have worked on some consoles where it almost didn't matter what the sound was or what the microphone was. You open the fader and you think, oh, that's perfect, you know. So I know that it is possible for the console to have an influence on the sound, but I can't articulate exactly what. I can't say this is the thing that is good about this console. But there are some that I've worked on that I would prefer never to see again, and then there are some that I would gladly make every record on this console.
Same model.
Yeah.
The same model of a
no, different makes, different designs. Yeah.
I just want to ask you about one record. Because I'm very curious because the Page and Plant album you did, because they didn't belong to your, unlike the Pixies or maybe Nirvana, whatever, these famous records you did, but Page and Plant are like much older than you.
A different generation.
I don't know if you like Led Zeppelin or not, but how was that? How was working with not with them specifically, but with a band that's older than you and huge and like that?
So it's really intimidating.
Okay.
I mean, that's the best word for it. It's intimidating because everyone that buys this record is also going to own 4 or 5 Led Zeppelin albums. And they're going to put them on the shelf right next to each other. And so it's naturally going to draw a comparison with some of the greatest albums ever made, right? So they're going to play 4 of the greatest albums ever made, and then they're going to play this one. And they're going to sit there and think, oh, well, maybe not, you know? So that's intimidating.
Were you a fan?
When I was in the throes of punk rock, Led Zeppelin was part of the sort of forbidden music, and I didn't take them very seriously. But as I matured and as I got beyond the kind of idiomatic punk rock mentality, when you listen to those records, they are immaculate. They are really impeccably made records, and they sound amazing.
And Jimmy Page is underrated,
Jimmy Page
as
is
a producer?
Phenomenal musician and a phenomenal producer.
But he's underrated probably because he didn't produce much outside Led Zeppelin, no?
But what else do you need?
No, I know. But nobody speaks when you say the greatest rock producers. Nobody mentions him, and he's amazing.
Yeah, I think the creativity on display in those records is amazing. And also, when you look at the credits, it will be just the most ridiculous thing. Like, the basic track was recorded in a barn, and then the overdub was done after a concert in New York, and then it was mixed, on amphetamines in Los Angeles 6 weeks later. Like it's just the most ridiculous, patchwork of stuff. But the sound is impeccable. Like somehow everything worked and was perfect. I really admire the sound of those records. And getting to work with Jimmy Page, I understand a little bit of his obsession with sound, and I think he is the reason that those records are the way they are, because there's a capacity that I've noticed in a few people, is the ability to hear through the music to find a detail inside the music. And there are a couple of people that come to mind when I talk about this. Jimmy Page can hear every little detail inside the music while he's listening to the overall picture of the music. The way I described it is that he sees every bird in the flock, And the best example of this was, there was a symphonic overdub or an orchestra overdub on one of their songs. And the arrangement was done fairly quickly. like on Thursday, they said, hey, why don't we put some strings on this song? So they called in the arranger, and then on Saturday, we had 20 members of the London Symphony Orchestra sitting in the studio, you know. So a very quick process of let's have some strings, and then 26 of the best players. The first violin on this overdub session was Nigel Kennedy.
Wow.
Just to give you an example of how, like,
Wow.
how they roll, on who they get
How
on
they
there.
roll.
Right? So this is just an overdub on one song. Let's get the London Symphony Orchestra and Nigel Kennedy in on it. You know, anyway. So so Jimmy Page had the score, and he was following along with the score while they were running through it, and he like pulled a face at one point, and then they ran through it again, and he pulled his face again, and then they did it with the music. They did it along with the take of the band, and he pulled the same face, and he got on the talkback, and he named the bar, and he said, you know, first violins, play that section, and then they played that bar, and he said, that's wrong. And on the score, the master score of the whole orchestration, there was an accidental on one note, like a sharp or a flat on one note. But on the copy that the violinists were using, the accidental was missing on that one note. And he heard it inside a whole orchestration with a rock band playing on top of it. He could hear that somebody played F natural instead of F sharp, you know, or whatever it was. Amazing. But everything was like that to him. Like he would listen to a take of the band, and his guitar would be, you know, an immaculate guitar part, but one note would be sour, and so he'd go and fix the one note, and just an incredible ear, but it's not just a natural thing. It's like his attention was focused in a way, in the same way that, like, you can feel something with your hand, but the tips of your fingers are much more sensitive. You can feel detail with the tips of your fingers, right? Like you can look at something with your whole eyeball, but the center of your field of vision, you can focus the center of your field of vision and you can see in much more detail. He has a way of doing that with his hearing, where he can hear the whole thing, but then part of his hearing is hearing this little detail, you know. And I have tried to develop that skill myself, and I feel like it compensates a little bit for the way everyone's hearing deteriorates as they get older. You know, I'm quite old now, so there's, you know, I must have worse hearing than I did when I was in my 20s. I must, right? But I feel like I can use this concentration to hear in detail some things that otherwise I might have been able to hear passively. But now I have to concentrate to hear them.
Did you stop being intimidated at any point during the recording?
No. I mean, the first session that we did a short session of 4 days just to test the waters, to see if we liked each other, to see if we got along, if they liked my working methods. And in those 4 days, we recorded and mixed 4 songs. Wow. And at the end of those 4 days, we decided to continue, and we booked 6 months at Abbey Road. So the remainder of the session was almost 6 months. And in those 6 months, we finished the album. But those 4 songs that we recorded and mixed in the first session, they survived unmolested to the very end. So in 4 days, we did 4 songs. And then in 6 months, we did 8 more.
And those 4 ones are more your way of working, no? Like more fast. More?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I mean, they were maybe the 4 that they were most prepared to play as a band, you know. Okay. And then the rest of it was a little bit more meticulous. But that whole session was really, to me, was really gratifying, because most of the people that I had worked with, in one way or another, we had some prior connection. Like they were friends of friends, or they had heard other records that were sort of in their peer group that I had worked on, or they had asked someone, hey, what was it like to work with Steve Albini, and they got a recommendation. In one way or another, most of the people I had worked with were connected to me in some way. This was the first session I had done that was completely out of the blue. Like I had no expectation. I just answered the phone one day, and it was Robert Plant on the phone, you know. So I was as surprised as anybody that I was asked to work on that record.
You didn't thought it was a prank?
No, although I have another story. I have another story.
Somebody's flashing me a red light, but please finish your story.
Okay. Sometime in the early 90s, I was away doing something on tour or doing a session at another studio, and my girlfriend, who's my wife now, Heather, she was my girlfriend at the time. She lived at the house where we had the studio. I had a studio. And she answered the phone, and she took a phone message, and the guy on the other end of the phone identified himself as Mo Austin, who was a famous music executive. Yeah, maybe the president of Warner's, I don't know. He had some big title. And he identified himself as Mo Austin, and my wife was like, okay, Mo Austin. And he seemed a little taken aback that the name didn't register. And then he said that he's working with Melissa Etheridge on a project of the soundtrack to a film biography of Janis Joplin. And they wanted to talk to me about recording the music. And my wife said, get the fuck out of here. Who is this? And Mo Austin reiterated that it was Mo Austin and that he was calling on behalf of Melissa Etheridge about working on this film project. And she was like, no, really, who the fuck is this? And we had a friend, John Forbes, who was kind of a prankster. He says, is this Forbes? You know. And eventually she got the details written down, and when I came home, she said this guy called for you. I don't know who, you know. And so, and I called back, and by the time I called back, they had moved on with the project. But you know, that's an example of how different my world is from someone who has a manager and an agent and that sort of thing.
Oh, well, I think we have to wrap this up. Thank you very much for your time and for being here.
No problem.
El señor Steve Albini.